Hello everyone, I'm Susan Totten, a registered and licensed dietitian, and my specialty area is as a certified diabetes educator. Today we're going to be talking about addressing nutrition with patients who have diabetes and how to do that during an office visit. So why is diabetes education so important to us anyway? Well, because it gets results. With diabetes, good nutrition knowledge is like good medicine. Just as important as the diabetes medicine, just as important as physical activity and healthy eating. So as we know, food choices have a major impact on blood glucose or blood sugar levels. But it's important to make sure that our patients know this too. Identifying carbohydrates and learning how to plan meals can help patients better manage their diabetes, feel better, and reach their blood glucose goals. Diet decisions need to be made daily. Patients are constantly confronted with when to eat, what to eat, where to eat, and how much to eat. And that's just for breakfast. And then lunch comes along and we have to repeat that process all over again. So planning ahead improves our odds of success with diabetes. So what are carbohydrates or carbs? Well, carbohydrates, also known as carbs, are one of the three main nutrients or macronutrients which make up the different foods that we eat. The other two building blocks or macronutrients are protein and fat. There are a lot of different nutrients in the foods that we eat, but the macronutrients are simply broken down into carbohydrate, protein, and fat. Our body actually needs all three of these macronutrients to be healthy, and these nutrients provide calories and energy to our body. Fat provides 9 calories per gram of ingested fat. Protein provides 4 calories per gram, and carbohydrate provides 4 calories per gram. All of this information is on the food nutrition fact label, but it is helpful to point out here that 1 gram of fat at 9 calories has more calories than a gram of protein and of carbohydrate together. So that's why we need to limit the fat in our diet, because the calories add up very, very quickly. Each of these three macronutrients, carbohydrate, protein, and fat, is found in a wide variety of foods, and often the foods we eat are a combination of these three, carbohydrate, protein, and fat. How do carbohydrates affect blood glucose levels? That's a very good question. When we eat foods with carbohydrates, our bodies digest the carbs or carbohydrates we eat into sugar or glucose, and our blood glucose levels start to rise. So as food is taken into the mouth and the digestion process starts, then food is broken down into those three macronutrients, carbohydrate, protein, and fat. Carbohydrate is then broken down further into sugar or glucose, and it travels into our bloodstream to provide us the nutrition and energy that we need. Of the three macronutrients in food, carbohydrate, protein, and fat, carbohydrates have the greatest and most immediate impact on blood glucose levels. 90 to 100% of the carbohydrate that we eat is converted to glucose within the first 15 minutes to 2 hours. This includes sugars, whether they're naturally occurring, and also added sugars. And it also includes starches. Sugar-free foods are not always carbohydrate-free or calorie-free. And it's important that patients know that. Sometimes we'll talk to them about their blood glucose values, and they'll say, well, I eat sugar-free, ice cream, or I eat sugar-free this or that. But some foods, even though they're labeled as sugar-free, are not always carbohydrate-free or calorie-free. So it's important that we're teaching patients how to read those food labels. It's also important that patients understand what foods contain carbohydrate. So here's a list. Grains, beans, and starchy vegetables. So breads, cereals, grains, rice, pasta, crackers, potatoes, corn, dried peas and beans, and winter squash Winter squash is like acorn or butternut squashes. Those have a little more carbohydrate in them than some of the spring and summer squashes like crookneck yellow squash or zucchini. Fruits also contain carbohydrates, whether it's fresh fruit, frozen fruit, canned fruit, dried fruit, or fruit juices. Any form of fruit has carbohydrate in it. And then there's milk, yogurt, and pudding. And then other carbohydrates would be like our sweets and desserts, ice cream, candy, cakes, pies. Sugar-sweetened beverages are also included here with sweet tea, which is very popular here in the South, and soda, regular soda, lemonade, Hi-C, punch, energy drinks, etc. What about non-starchy vegetables? These are basically all the other vegetables except for the starchy ones, and we've listed the starchy ones. So potatoes, corn, dried peas and beans, and winter squash. The non-starchy vegetable list would include things like lettuce, cucumbers, broccoli, cauliflower, radishes, carrots, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, spinach, kale, collard zucchini, yellow crookneck squash, and string beans. So a couple of key things to point out here. Starchy vegetables are moved from the vegetable group, if you will, into the grain group because they affect our blood glucose the same way that bread, pasta, crackers, rice, those sorts of things do. They have a similar effect on our blood glucose values. Another important thing to note is that cheese is no longer in the dairy group as we would consider it. So cheese gets moved to the protein group and is considered part of a protein because cheese, with the processing of cheese, it loses some of that carbohydrate and affects our blood glucose more like protein. So things like milk, pudding, yogurt will have a greater impact on our blood glucose values, and cheese, because it's higher in fat content and some of the carbohydrate has been broken down or processed, cheese actually affects our blood glucose more similarly to a high-fat protein. And then also tomatoes and carrots for the diabetic patient would be considered part of the non-starchy vegetable group. They have an impact on blood glucose that's more similar to things like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, spinach, zucchini than they would other foods. And then string beans, you'll definitely get questions about that when patients hear that dried peas and beans are in the starchy group. They'll ask, well, what about green beans or string beans? And those are considered non-starchy. So a couple of key points there about how foods shift a little bit for the diabetic patient. What foods do not contain carbohydrate? Well, these would be our protein foods like meat, chicken, poultry, fish, beef, and pork. They typically do not contain a lot of carbohydrate. They're mostly protein with some fat, medium fat, or a lot of fat. However, if these protein foods are prepared with sweet sauces or breading or batter, they may contain carbohydrates because carbohydrates have been added back to those foods. So let's bear that in mind as well. Fats, such as oils and butters, do not contain carbohydrate. They do contain a lot of fat, and eating too much fat may increase your weight by adding extra calories to your daily food intake. And we can't forget calories because calories add up. And we know that all three of our macronutrients contain calories. Carbohydrate counting. What is carbohydrate counting? It's a skill or a method of meal planning used to help better achieve blood glucose control. There are also other methods of meal planning, such as the hand method, or the hand is your guide to serving size, the plate method, and the exchange system. We'll discuss some of those in just a minute. So the hand as a guide to portion size, that can be very helpful because we always have our hand with us. And so typically a fist is considered about the size of 1 cup. The palm of your hand is considered typically about 3 ounces, or the size of a deck of cards, and that's a good indicator for appropriate protein amount for a person. Also, the thumb is typically 1 ounce. It could be equivalent to 1 ounce of cheese, or 1 ounce of peanut butter, or a tablespoon of peanut butter would be the entire length of the thumb. And then the thumb tip down to the first joint is considered to be about a tablespoon in serving size. So teaching our patients how to address serving size with their hand can be very important. Now, truthfully, not all hands are the same size, so it's important that if you have someone who is a bigger man or male, who's taller, and they say, well, what about my portion size for my hand? You know, that's bigger than 3 ounces. Well, the truth of the matter is they may need a slightly larger portion of meat at a meal, but not the size of their entire hand, not, 12 or 16 ounces of meat. We just really need to sort of stick with 3 to 4 ounces of meat or protein at the meal. Also with the fist size, for some larger patients, the first 3 fingers of the fist may be equivalent to a cup size. And so it's important for us to address that with patients and to let them know that to look at their individual hand and how it compares to the serving sizes that we're asking. And then the plate method. We've talked about this a bit before. The diabetes plate is 50% low carbohydrate vegetables or non-starchy vegetables. A quarter of the plate is your protein source, your lean proteins. And then the top quarter of the plate would be your grains and carbohydrate containing vegetables. So this gives you an idea of what a typical meal may look like, or plate may look like, for someone who has diabetes, and it can be a very helpful visual and teaching tool. So carbohydrates, when we talk about counting them, sometimes we can get a little intimidated by that, but carbohydrates can be counted 2 ways. Carbohydrates are usually measured in grams or in servings or exchanges. So 1 serving or exchange, which is just a unit of measure, is the amount of food that contains 15 grams of carbohydrate. A serving, in this situation, you want to explain to patients, is just a standard unit of measure. It doesn't mean that 1 serving of bread, which is typically 1 slice of bread, is all that they can have at a meal. It means that that is 1 serving of carbohydrate, and we will talk to them about how many carbohydrate servings they can have at a meal. But a serving or a unit of standard measure is necessary because we all have different nutrition needs. And so in this case, 1 serving of carbohydrate is equal to 15 grams. So what are some typical examples of just a 15-gram carbohydrate portion? And this is why we want to differentiate for patients, serving being a unit of measure. So a half a cup of cooked starchy vegetable is typically about 15 grams of carbohydrate, and that would be something like a half a cup of mashed potatoes. 1.5 cups of cooked non-starchy vegetables would typically be about 15 grams of carbohydrate. And that would be something like broccoli, steamed broccoli. 3 cups of raw non-starchy vegetable would be equivalent to 15 grams of carbohydrate. And when you begin discussing this with patients, they may say, well, I thought non-starchy vegetables were free. And when we're eating 1 serving or small amount, that may be the case. But if we have a big enough portion of the non-starchy vegetables, they can be equivalent in carbohydrate to a starchy vegetable. But look at how much more volume or vegetable or food you get for the same amount of carbohydrate. Another example of 15 grams of carbohydrate would be a half a cup of cooked cereal like oatmeal or grits, 1 ounce of bread product, which would be an example of just a slice of loaf bread, 1 small fruit, a half of a banana or half of a grapefruit, and 1 cup of milk, preferably a low-fat milk like 1% or skim milk. What about combination foods? So many times carbohydrates are not just in pure form. They are mixed in foods that also contain protein and fat. And here are some examples that you can share with patients. 1 taco would be about 15 grams of carbohydrate. 1 cup of super stew would be about 15 grams of carbohydrate. This can vary, but these are just some generalizations. 1 cup of chili with meat and beans would be about 30 grams of carbohydrate. 1 regular fast food hamburger would be about 30 grams. A 6-inch submarine sub would be about 45 grams of carbohydrate. 1 10-inch burrito with beef and beans would be somewhere in the neighborhood of 45 to 60 grams of carbohydrate. And 1 slice of thin crust pizza, about a quarter of a 12-inch pizza pie, would be about 35 grams of carbohydrate or so, but it would need to be the thin crust. Thick crust and more traditional crusts have a lot more carbohydrate in them. So for example, when we're talking about combination foods, it's helpful to point out to patients that if they pull the meal apart, if they pull that food apart and try to count up the carbohydrate in there, that's going to be the equivalent of the carbohydrate grams. So let's use the fast food hamburger as our example. A fast food hamburger typically has, and we're talking about the regular size on the regular menu, not the specialty burgers or the super size. But a regular fast food hamburger typically will have a bun with a top and a bottom piece of the bun, and each of those would be 15 grams of carbohydrate. The meat on that hamburger is a protein food, so it doesn't have a lot of carbohydrate on it. Even if they add a slice of cheese, we need to remember that cheese is more absorbed in the body like a protein food rather than a carbohydrate. And then lettuce, tomato, pickle, all of those things would be very low in carbohydrate. So really, essentially, with a fast food hamburger, we're counting just the bun as our carbohydrate item. I hope that helps. Where can you find carbohydrate information? Definitely you can find it in the nutrition facts panel on food labels. You can also get information about carbohydrate content from weighing and measuring food amounts. Lists of exchanges or servings are available, and restaurant food guides or nutrition facts are oftentimes available in restaurants like at McDonald's or places like that. Sometimes they're on the placemat that's on the tray. And then from websites like Calorie King or restaurant websites now have this information, Wendy's.com or Starbucks.com, etc. What's a good shortcut to reading a food label? Because time is limited, not only in the office visit, but our patients' time is limited too. And so they want to know what's the quick way? What's the quick way to get the information that I need? First, recommend that the patient check the serving size on the food label. All nutrition facts listed on the food label refer to this serving size. So if your patient is having a different serving size, they'll need to adjust the calories, the carbohydrate, the fat grams, all of that to the serving size that they're actually eating. Secondly, so first serving size, second, look at the total grams of carbohydrate. Carbohydrate grams are not listed by the serving size. This measurement is a measure of weight or volume, and that's at the top of the label. I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a minute. Carbohydrate grams are listed under the total serving, carbohydrate grams are listed under the total carbohydrates portion of the food nutrition fact label. And total carbohydrate, it's important to note, is a measure of all of the carbohydrate in that food. The starches, the sugars, whether they're natural or added, whether they're including sugar alcohols and fiber. So this is an example of a food label to just get a rough idea of what we're talking about. And in the top here, you can see that the serving size is half a cup. And this 31 grams here is not the carbohydrate grams. That's not what we're talking about. 31 grams or 1.1 ounces is a weight or volume measurement. So we want to first look at serving size, which is here, half a cup. And then we want to come down here to total carbohydrate, and that's listed at 24 grams. So that 24 grams includes the 10 grams of fiber, the 1 gram of soluble fiber, the 6 grams of sugars, and the 7 grams of other carbohydrate. All of this are subcategories beneath that total carbohydrate number. But your patient needs to focus here on total carbohydrate because that's all of the carbohydrate that's in that food product that will affect their blood glucose value. And then how many carbohydrates do we need? So to control weight, typically we think about, or maintain weight, we are thinking about 3 to 4 servings or 45 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per meal for women. Sometimes it can be 2 to 4 servings. Men typically about 4 to 5 servings or 60 to 75 grams per meal, and this would be to control or maintain weight. To lose weight, women typically need to have about 2 to 3 servings or 30 to 45 grams per meal, and men need to reduce their carbohydrate intake as well to about 3 to 4 servings or 45 to 60 grams per meal, and this is to lose weight. Overall, a recommended total daily carbohydrate intake is somewhere in the neighborhood of 9 to 16 servings, depending on whether they're male or female, their age, whether they're young or older, how active they are. But this will be somewhere in the neighborhood of 130 grams to 240 grams, and that's divided over the entire day. So divided over meals and snacks would be those numbers. So final thoughts. Understanding carbohydrates and their impact on blood glucose numbers takes skill and practice. And so we need to discuss this in our office visit with patients so that they can be thinking about it and they can learn these skills. Encourage patients to be carbohydrate detectives. And what I mean by that is to make it a little bit of where they're investigating the carbohydrates. So collect data by testing blood glucose values before and then again 2 hours after a favorite meal that they might have. So if Monday night is always spaghetti night, have the patient check their blood glucose before they eat, right before the meal, and then have them test blood glucose again 2 hours after the start of the meal to see what numbers you get. This can be very revealing to the patient because then it shows how carbohydrate has directly affected or impacted their blood glucose values. And so these numbers mean something to the patient. It doesn't mean that the patient has been bad, but it just means that the meal may need to be altered to get a better result. If blood glucose is above goal 2 hours post-meal or after the meal, then work with the patient at the next visit to alter that meal for a better result next time. It may be as simple as something as changing the sweetened beverage at that meal to water or another carb-free beverage. So maybe asking them to give up their sweet tea, but maybe have just plain unsweetened tea or tea with an artificial sweetener or maybe stevia or just water at that meal. And that will decrease significantly the total carbohydrate consumption at that meal. Or maybe adjusting the portion size of the carbohydrate containing food at that meal and leaving the rest of the plate alone will do the trick. So maybe perhaps it's an example of, chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. And maybe what we need to do is to use the plate method with that and have the patient having more of the non-starchy vegetable, a bigger portion of the green beans, a reasonable portion of the protein, and then a smaller portion of the mashed potatoes. So those are just some quick thoughts to help with addressing patient concerns in the office visit. I hope this has been helpful, and good luck with your patients, and thank you for your attention today.